In the middle of the South Pacific, far from major cities and global trade routes, sits one of the smallest countries on Earth. Nauru is only about 21 square kilometers in area, small enough that a determined person could drive around its coastal road in less than an hour. Yet this tiny island has lived through a story far bigger than its size suggests: colonial rule, war, sudden wealth, environmental destruction, financial collapse, and a complicated modern relationship with Australia. Nauru is often introduced through statistics, but its real significance is in what those statistics reveal. It is a country where geography, natural resources, and outside power collided in unusually concentrated form. Nauru lies in the Micronesia subregion of Oceania, with its nearest neighbor, Banaba in Kiribati, roughly 300 kilometers to the east. That isolation shaped almost everything about the island's history. Unlike large countries with diverse landscapes and multiple economic centers, Nauru is a single raised coral island surrounded by ocean. Its population is only around 12,000 people, making it one of the least populated sovereign states in the world. It is also the smallest member of the Commonwealth of Nations by both area and population. In practical terms, this means Nauru has the responsibilities of a modern state: diplomacy, public services, infrastructure, and economic planning, but with an extremely limited land base and a very small domestic market. Long before outsiders redrew maps of the Pacific, Nauru was settled by Micronesian peoples, likely around 1000 BCE. For centuries, life on the island was organized around local communities, fishing, coconut palms, and the rhythms of a small ocean society. In an environment with little land and limited fresh water, survival depended on careful adaptation. The sea was not just a barrier, it was also a source of food, movement, and cultural connection. This older history matters because it reminds us that Nauru was not an empty rock waiting to be discovered. It was a lived-in island society before it became valuable to empires and mining companies. In the late 19th century, Nauru was annexed by the German Empire, becoming part of Germany's Pacific colonial possessions. Like many small islands during this era, Nauru's fate was increasingly decided by distant capitals. European colonial powers were interested in strategic positions, labor, trade, and resources. For Nauru, the decisive resource would soon be phosphate. At first glance, phosphate is not glamorous. It is a mineral used in fertilizer, vital for agriculture because it helps plants grow. But in a world of expanding farms and growing populations, phosphate became economically important. Nauru's small size hid a remarkable fact: beneath much of its surface lay rich phosphate deposits that could be extracted close to the ground. Starting around 1900, phosphate mining transformed Nauru. The island was a phosphate rock island, and its interior contained deposits created over long periods by natural processes involving coral limestone and seabird guano. Because the phosphate lay near the surface, it was profitable to mine. But the method was devastating. Strip mining removed soil and vegetation, leaving behind jagged limestone pinnacles across large parts of the interior. The economic logic was simple: the phosphate was valuable, and demand existed overseas. The environmental result was catastrophic. Much of the land that could have supported agriculture, housing, or other uses was damaged or rendered difficult to use. Nauru's wealth was literally dug out from under it. World War I changed Nauru's rulers. Australia occupied the island, and after the war Nauru became a League of Nations mandate administered by Australia, with New Zealand and the United Kingdom as co-trustees. This arrangement presented itself as international oversight rather than traditional colonial conquest, but in practice, Nauruans still did not fully control their island's most important resource. Phosphate continued to be extracted for the benefit of agriculture elsewhere, especially in Australia and New Zealand. The contrast was stark. Nauru's land was being permanently altered, while much of the economic value flowed outward. This pattern would become central to Nauru's later demands for sovereignty and compensation. During World War II, Nauru was occupied by Japan for 3 years. For such a small island, the war brought immense disruption. Pacific Islands became strategic points in a much larger military conflict, and local populations often suffered under occupation, displacement, and shortages. After the war ended, Nauru became a United Nations Trust territory, again administered by Australia. The language of trusteeship suggested that the administering powers were preparing the island for self-government. But the central question remained unresolved: how could a people inherit an island whose interior had been heavily mined by others? Political independence would be meaningful, but it would also come with an environmental and economic burden already decades in the making. Nauru gained independence from Australia in 1968. For a newly sovereign microstate, Phosphate seemed to offer an extraordinary opportunity. Many newly independent countries struggled because they lacked valuable exports, but Nauru had a resource the world wanted. For a time, phosphate revenues made Nauru appear exceptionally wealthy on a per-person basis. The government invested mining income through trust funds intended to support the country after the deposits ran out. In theory, this was a smart strategy: turn a finite natural resource into long-term financial security. But the challenge was enormous. Managing sudden wealth is difficult for any state, and especially difficult for a very small country with limited institutions, intense political pressures, and few alternative industries. Nauru became a classic example of what is often called the resource curse. This term describes countries that appear blessed with valuable natural resources but end up economically unstable, politically strained, or environmentally damaged because of them. In Nauru's case, phosphate created dependence. The island economy revolved around one export, and that export was finite. When money was flowing, it could mask deeper problems: damaged land, limited food production, limited economic diversity, and heavy reliance on imported goods. Mismanagement of accumulated mining wealth worsened the problem. Instead of securing Nauru's future indefinitely, much of the wealth was lost through poor investments, overspending, and changing economic conditions. By the 1990s, Nauru's viable phosphate reserves had largely been exhausted. This was not just an economic event, it was a national turning point. The industry that had dominated the island for nearly a century could no longer provide the same income. But the land it left behind was still scarred. A large portion of the island's interior had been stripped, making development and environmental restoration difficult. Through the 2000s, Nauru faced serious financial troubles. A country that had once seemed wealthy became highly vulnerable. With few resources, a tiny population, and limited land, it had to search for new ways to fund government services and maintain sovereignty. One of the most controversial chapters in modern Nauru's story is its relationship with Australia over immigration detention. At various points since 2001, Nauru has accepted Australian aid in exchange for hosting the Nauru Regional Processing Centre, an offshore facility used in Australia's asylum seeker policy. For Australia, offshore processing allowed it to keep certain migrants and asylum seekers outside its mainland legal and political space. For Nauru, the arrangement brought revenue and employment opportunities, but also international criticism and moral controversy. The facility placed Nauru inside a debate much larger than the island itself: border control, human rights, sovereignty, and the unequal bargaining power between a wealthy regional power and a financially vulnerable microstate. Because Nauru has depended heavily on Australian assistance, some observers have described it as an Australian client state. That phrase is politically loaded, but it points to a real issue: small states may be legally sovereign while still having limited practical room to maneuver. Nauru is a member of the United Nations, the Commonwealth of Nations, and the Organization of African, Caribbean and Pacific States, so it has a formal voice in international affairs. Yet economic dependence can shape choices. When a country's budget, employment, and services are tied to outside support, independence becomes complicated. Nauru's story shows that sovereignty is not only about flags and seats at the UN, it is also about economic resilience. In the 2010s, Nauru's economy gradually recovered, but the deeper questions remain. How does a tiny island rebuild after a century of extractive mining? How does it diversify when it has almost no land, a small population, and great distance from major markets? And how should the world understand responsibility for environmental damage caused under colonial and trustee administrations? Nauru is not simply a cautionary tale about bad decisions by a small country. It is also a story about global demand, imperial control, resource extraction, and the vulnerability of small island states. Its history compresses many modern problems into one place: climate and environment, development, migration politics, and unequal power. Nauru may be one of the world's smallest countries, but its history is anything but small. It began as an isolated Pacific society, became a colonial resource frontier, gained independence with extraordinary phosphate wealth, and then faced the consequences when that resource ran out. Today, Nauru continues to exist as a sovereign state under difficult conditions, balancing international partnerships, economic necessity, and the legacy of a mined landscape. Its story challenges the idea that natural wealth always brings security. Sometimes, what looks like a blessing can become a trap, especially when outsiders control the terms. Nauru is a reminder that the fate of small places can reveal the forces shaping the entire world. If you found this helpful, please like this video and subscribe for more explainers.